I was at the park with my son when I found a lost little girl. She told me she lived in the house with the lilacs. I knew that house. It was my late wife's childhood home. When I walked the little girl to the door, I froze in shock. The woman who answered was my wife, who had died a year ago. This is a story about a coincidence so impossible it had to be fate. Before we get into it, I have a quick question for you. What is your favorite season of the year? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Okay, let's head to that park. For the last year, my life has been a ghost story. I live in a house haunted by the memory of my late wife, Serafina. Her ghost is in the half-empty closet, in the scent of her favorite vanilla-scented candle that I still can't bring myself to throw away. But the most powerful ghost of all is the one I see every day in the face of our son, Theo. He has her eyes, the same brilliant, startling shade of green, and her smile, a perfect, beautiful, and heartbreaking echo of a melody I thought I would never hear again. He is 7 years old, my brave, quiet little man, and I am trying my best to be both a mother and a father to him, a task for which I feel profoundly and deeply unqualified. Sarah was the sun in our small, happy universe. I was just a quiet, steady planet, happy to orbit her light. Now the sun is gone, and we are just two small, cold planets drifting in the quiet, empty darkness. On this particular Saturday afternoon, a day of beautiful and almost cruelly cheerful autumn sunshine, I had taken Theo to the city's largest park. It was a place full of our own ghosts. It was where Sarah and I had had our first date, where we had gotten married under the branches of a grand old oak tree. But it was also a place of life, a place for a 7-year-old boy to run and to climb and to forget, for a little while, the quiet sadness of our home. I was sitting on a bench watching him play on the swings when I saw her. She was a little girl, no older than Theo, with a wild mane of dark, curly hair, and she was standing all by herself near the entrance to the park's small wooded trail. She was crying, not with loud, theatrical sobs, but with the quiet, desperate, and terrified tears of a child who is truly and completely lost. My heart, a thing that I had thought was now a numb, scarred-over muscle, ached for her. I walked over, my own son trailing curiously behind me. "Hey there," I said, my voice a soft, gentle thing. "Are you lost? Are you looking for your mommy or daddy?" She looked up at me, her eyes a startlingly familiar shade of green, wide with fear. She just nodded, unable to speak, a single perfect tear tracing a path through the dirt on her small cheek. I spent the next 20 minutes in a state of quiet, focused purpose, a feeling that I had not felt in a long time. I was no longer a grieving husband. I was a father, a protector. I asked her name. "Willow," she whispered. I asked her if she knew her address or her parents' phone number. She just shook her head, her small body trembling. "It's okay," I said, my voice a soothing, calm instrument. "We'll find them. Do you remember anything about your house? Anything at all?" She thought for a long, hard moment, her little brow furrowed in concentration, and then her face lit up with a single, clear memory. "My house is the one with the big purple lilac bush by the front door, the one that smells like vanilla."
The world seemed to stop. The sound of the children laughing on the playground, the distant traffic, the rustle of the autumn leaves, it all just faded away into a dull roaring in my ears. The house with the lilacs that smell like vanilla. It was not a phrase. It was a memory. It was a line from a story my own wife, my beautiful, lost Sarah, had told me 100 times. It was her description of the magical fairy tale house she had grown up in, on the other side of town. It was a coincidence, a strange, impossible, and heartbreakingly beautiful coincidence. But in a life that had been so devoid of magic for so long, it was a coincidence I could not and would not ignore. I looked at the small, lost girl in front of me, and a new, wild, and utterly insane idea began to form in my mind. "You know what, Willow?" I said, my voice now a strange and hopeful thing. "I think I might know just where that is." The drive across town was a journey into a part of my own heart I had kept locked away for the past year. It was a drive into the past, into Sarah's old neighborhood, a place I had not had the courage to visit since her funeral. As I drove, my mind was a chaotic war between logic and a desperate, foolish hope. "It's just a coincidence," the logical part of my brain insisted. "Lots of old houses have lilac bushes. You're a grieving man seeing ghosts where there are none." But the other part of me, the part that still ached for her, just whispered, "What if?" In the back seat, the two children, my son and this strange new girl, were having a quiet conversation of their own. Now that she felt safe, Willow was beginning to open up. I listened to her small, sweet voice as I drove, every word a new and deeply unsettling clue. "How did you get separated from your mummy?" I heard my son Theo ask. "Our puppy, Daisy, she saw a big fluffy squirrel, and she ran away into the woods. Mummy told me to stay right on the bench and she would be right back. But then a big band started playing really loud, and a big crowd of people came, and they were all standing up, and I couldn't see her anymore. I waited, and I got scared, so I started to walk. And then," she dropped her voice to a whisper, "I was lost." It was such a simple and perfectly plausible story, a story that happened in parks all over the world every single day. But every innocent detail she shared seemed to have a strange and deeply familiar echo. "I love to draw," she was telling Theo now. "My mummy says I have my mother's hands." A strange turn of phrase for a 6-year-old. She spoke of her love for the color yellow, of her hatred for broccoli, of the way she would sing made-up songs to her puppy. Each detail, each small, insignificant preference was a perfect one-to-one match with my own lost Sarah. I was living in a dream, a beautiful and deeply unsettling waking dream. I finally turned onto her old street, the street, a quiet, tree-lined avenue of old, beautiful, and deeply familiar houses, the houses I had seen in 1,000 of her old family photographs. I drove slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I was about to ask Willow if she recognized anything, if any of the houses looked familiar. But before I could even get the words out, she leaned forward, her small hand pressing against the back of my seat, and she pointed out the window. Her voice was a cry of pure, unadulterated, and joyful recognition. "There it is!" she shrieked, bouncing in her seat. "That's my house! I told you! The one with the lilacs!"
I slammed on the brakes, the old car groaning in protest. I stared at the house she was pointing to. It was a house I knew as well as my own. It was a beautiful 2-story Victorian with a large wraparound porch and a magnificent, ancient, and deeply familiar lilac bush in the front yard. It was the house I had picked Sarah up from for our very first date. It was the house where I had first met her parents. It was the house of my own most cherished memories. A house that, I had been told, had been sold to a family of strangers years ago, after her parents had passed. My mind was screaming that it was impossible, a trick, a coincidence so profound it had to be a hallucination. But as I looked from the familiar, welcoming front porch of that house to the small, joyful, and deeply, deeply familiar-looking little girl in my back seat, I knew that I was not in a dream. I was about to knock on a door that would lead me directly into the heart of a ghost story. And I had a terrible and wonderful feeling that the ghost was about to answer. I pulled the car over to the curb, the engine idling, a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to the wild, frantic drumming of my own heart. I stared at the house. It was a place I knew as well as my own, a place I had not had the courage to even drive past in over a year. It was the house where I had picked Sarah up for our first date, her beautiful, laughing face framed in that very same doorway. It was a house of ghosts, a house of memories, and now a house of an impossible and deeply unsettling mystery. "Come on, Daddy," my son Theo said, his voice full of a child's simple impatience, pulling me from my reverie. "Willow's home." I got out of the car, my legs feeling unsteady as if I were walking in a dream. The two children, my son, and the strange, familiar little girl in my back seat scrambled out of the back seat and ran ahead of me. Up the familiar stone pathway, I followed, a man on autopilot, my mind a screaming chaos of logic and a strange, undeniable sense of fate. The air was thick with the scent of the massive, ancient lilac bush by the front porch, and it was just as Sarah had always described it, a sweet, heady perfume that smelled impossibly of vanilla. Willow, in her excitement to be home, ran up the porch steps and pressed the doorbell, a cheerful, familiar chime that echoed from a life I thought was long since over. The door opened, and the world stopped. It was not a woman who looked like my late wife. It was not a woman who bore a passing resemblance. It was her. It was Sarah, standing in the doorway, a look of warm, maternal concern on her face, her green eyes, the same brilliant, startling shade of green as my own son's eyes, her smile, the same small, curious tilt of her head. The only difference was that her hair was cut shorter, a chic, modern bob instead of the long, flowing waves I had loved. But it was her. It was an impossible and deeply, deeply cruel miracle. My mind, my heart, my very soul seemed to shatter into 1,000 pieces. I was looking at a ghost. I was frozen on the pathway, unable to move, unable to breathe. But the children were not. "Mommy!" Willow cried out, a sound of pure, joyous relief, and she ran past me and threw her arms around the woman's legs. And then my own son, Theo, who had been standing beside me, clutching my hand, let go. He looked at the woman's face, the face he had only known from the photographs that filled our sad, quiet house. And with the simple, beautiful, and utterly heartbreaking logic of a 7-year-old boy who has just been presented with a miracle, he let out a cry of his own.
"Mommy?" he whispered, his voice full of a desperate and truly impossible hope. And he too ran forward, and he clung to the strange woman's other leg, burying his small, tear-streaked face in the fabric of her dress. The woman in the doorway, the ghost of my wife, was now in a state of equal and total shock. She looked down at her own daughter, and then at this strange, beautiful little boy who was now also calling her mommy. And then her gaze, her beautiful, familiar, and deeply, deeply confused green eyes lifted and met mine. She saw my face. She saw my son's face. She saw, I am sure, her own face, reflected back at her in the features of two strangers who were now standing on her porch, looking at her as if she had just returned from the dead. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was not just looking at a ghost, I was looking at a perfect, living, breathing impossibility.
I wasn't just losing my mind, I was losing my grip on the very fabric of reality itself. The woman, this impossible woman, looked at me, her own face a mirror of my own shocked confusion, but with an added layer of a new, dawning, and terrible suspicion. "I don't know who you are," she whispered, her voice a strange and yet terribly familiar sound. "But you're looking at me as if you've just seen a ghost." "Sarah?" I finally managed to whisper, the name a ghost on my own lips. The woman looked up at me, and her eyes, my late wife's eyes, were full of a new, dawning, and terrible pity. "I don't know who Sarah is," she said, her voice a soft, gentle thing that was both a comfort and a torture. "My name is Rosalind." She looked from my stunned, grieving face to my small, weeping son who was still calling her mommy, and she made a decision. "Please," she said, her voice a quiet invitation, "come inside. I think we have a great deal to talk about." I walked into my late wife's childhood home for the very first time. A surreal, out-of-body experience. The house was different, of course, the furniture new, the photographs on the wall of a family I did not know. But the bones of the house, the layout, the scent of old wood and beeswax, it was all exactly as Sarah had described it to me 1,000 times. I was a stranger in a place that felt impossibly like home. We sat in her sunlit living room. The two children, my Theo and her Willow, now quiet, just stared at each other from opposite ends of the sofa. Two small, identical puzzle pieces from two different boxes. And we, the two adults, began the slow and deeply painful work of trying to assemble that puzzle. I told her my story. I pulled out my wallet and, with a trembling hand, I showed her the photograph I always carried. A picture of me and my Sarah on our wedding day, standing under that old oak tree in the park. She took the photograph from me, and her own hand began to tremble. She just stared at it, at her own face, at her own smile, a life she had never lived. And then she told me her story. She had been adopted as a baby. She had been raised as an only child by a loving, wonderful couple who had passed away years ago. She had never known her birth parents. She had never, in her entire life, had any reason to believe that she was not completely and totally alone in the world. We sat there, in that quiet, sunlit room, the two of us, a grieving widower, and a woman who had just discovered her own ghost, and the impossible, undeniable truth began to settle over us. We were not crazy. We were not dreaming. We were two halves of a single, tragic, and long-buried story.
"We have to know the truth," Rosalind said, her voice now full of a new, fierce, and powerful resolve. "We have to know if it's true, if your wife and I are really related." And so began our search. It was a journey into the past, a quiet and often frustrating investigation. We started with their adoptions. Both had been closed, the records sealed by the laws of the state from that time. We had a brick wall of bureaucratic red tape, a wall of privacy laws designed to protect the very secret we were so desperate to uncover. We spent weeks digging through old, dusty records in my own city archives. We hired a private investigator. We found nothing. The trail was cold. A ghost of a story that was almost 30 years old. It felt hopeless. I was beginning to think we would never know the truth, that the story of Sarah and Rosalind would forever be a beautiful and deeply tragic mystery. And then I remembered the box. It was a memory from a long, quiet conversation I had had with Sarah years ago. A memory that had been buried under the weight of my own grief. She had told me about a small, hand-carved wooden memory box her adoptive mother had given her on her 18th birthday. She told me it contained the truth of where I came from, Sarah had told me, a sad, distant look in her eyes. But I never opened it. My life with my new parents was the only truth I needed. The past, it just felt too painful to look at. The box, it was still in our attic, a dusty, forgotten, and until this very moment, completely unimportant relic of a life that was now gone. I looked at Rosalind, at my late wife's face, and I felt a surge of a new and brilliant and almost terrifying hope. The legal system had sealed their past away forever. The paper trail had gone cold. But a mother's love, a mother's need to tell her daughter the truth, that was a thing that could not be so easily erased. I had no idea what was inside that box. But as I looked at the new, hopeful face of my late wife's lost sister, I knew it was no longer just a box of old painful memories. It was a key, and I had to go home and I had to find it. A memory. A small, seemingly insignificant detail from a long-ago conversation, now suddenly the most important clue in the entire world. The memory box. I looked at Rosalind, at my late wife's face, now filled with a new, fragile, and desperate hope. "There might be something," I said, my voice a rush of a sudden, brilliant excitement. "At my house, in the attic. A box her mother gave her. She never opened it." We left her house, a place of new and strange connections, and we drove to mine, a place of old and familiar grief. The journey back across town was a silent and deeply sacred pilgrimage. We were no longer just a man and a woman, we were partners on a quest. Two detectives on the verge of solving the single greatest mystery of both our lives. My attic was a dusty, quiet, and forgotten country of the past. It was filled with the ghosts of a life that I had shared with Sarah. Old furniture shrouded in white sheets like sleeping giants. Boxes of college textbooks. Of our son Theo's outgrown baby clothes. And in a far, forgotten corner, under a stack of old photo albums, was the box. It was just as Sarah had described it, a small, simple, and beautifully hand-carved wooden box with a small tarnished brass latch. It was not locked. I carried it downstairs, my hands trembling as if I were carrying a sacred and possibly explosive relic. We sat together on the floor of my quiet living room. The two children, Theo and Willow, now playing quietly together in the corner with a set of building blocks, a small, beautiful island of a new and innocent family. I placed the box on the coffee table between us. "Are you ready?" I asked Rosalind, my voice a whisper. She just nodded, her own eyes, my late wife's eyes, shining with a mixture of a profound hope and a deep, terrible fear of what we might, or might not, find inside. I took a deep breath, and I opened the box. The inside was lined with a faded blue velvet, and on top was a single, small, and impossibly tiny pair of knitted baby booties, a soft, pale yellow. Rosalind let out a small, choked sob and reached out, her fingers tracing the delicate yarn. Beneath the booties were two small plastic hospital bracelets, the kind they put on newborns. They were brittle with age. One had the name Baby Girl A typed onto the small white card. The other, identical, read Baby Girl B. And then, at the very bottom of the box,
was a single faded and folded photograph. I picked it up with a reverence I did not know I possessed. I unfolded it, and the full, undeniable, and heartbreakingly beautiful truth was finally revealed. It was a picture of two babies, two tiny, perfect, and absolutely identical newborn girls, wrapped in pink and blue striped hospital blankets, their small wrinkled faces a mirror image of each other, lying side by side in a single hospital bassinet. With a hand that was shaking so violently I could barely control it, I turned the photograph over. On the back, in the familiar, elegant, and slightly faded handwriting of my late wife's adoptive mother, was an inscription. My dearest Serafina and her sister Rosalind, August 14th, 1995. They told me it was for the best that you were separated. They told me it would be less confusing if you never knew. I have never believed them. A heart should never be split in two. I pray that one day, somehow, the universe will bring you back to each other. I looked at Rosalind, my late wife's sister, my son's new aunt, and I saw the full, beautiful, and tragic story of her life and of my life's in her tear-streaked face. The search was over. The ghost had a name. The puzzle was complete. The impossible, beautiful, and unthinkable truth was real. And now the much harder and much more beautiful work of piecing together two families and two lifetimes into one was just about to begin. We sat on the floor of my quiet living room for a long, long time. The small faded photograph of the two newborn sisters held between us, a sacred and heartbreaking relic. The silence in the room was not an empty one. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of two lifetimes lived apart, of a sisterhood that had been stolen before it ever had a chance to begin. We wept. We wept for the mother who had to make an impossible choice. We wept for the two identical baby girls who were sent out into the world alone. And we wept for my Sarah, the woman who had lived her entire beautiful life without ever knowing that the other half of her own heart was beating somewhere out there in the world. The days and weeks that followed were a quiet, strange, and deeply beautiful process of discovery. Our two separate families, the family of a grieving widower and the family of a woman who had just discovered her own ghost, began to slowly and cautiously merge. Rosalind and her daughter Willow became a constant and welcome presence in my quiet, sad house, and my son Theo and I found a new second home in her beautiful house with the lilacs.
We did not just build a new future. We began the slow and often painful work of piecing together a shared past. Rosalind would spend hours looking through my old photo albums at the pictures of Sarah, the sister she had never known. She would trace the lines of her own face in my wife's, a look of profound and deeply moving wonder in her eyes. "She had my smile," she would whisper. In return, I learned about her. I learned about the life Sarah might have had, a life lived in a different city, with different parents, but with the same quiet strength, the same love for art, the same ridiculously silly sense of humor. And our children, our two beautiful, resilient children, they were the true and undeniable proof of the miracle that had happened. Theo and Willow, who were not just cousins, but, as we learned, the genetic half-siblings who shared the DNA of two identical mothers, became inseparable. They looked so much alike with their shared brilliant green eyes that the world saw them as brother and sister. And in a way, they were. They were two halves of a single beautiful story, finally and completely brought together. It has been a year now. I am standing in a sun-drenched garden, the air thick with the sweet, familiar scent of lilacs that smell of vanilla. It is the garden of the house with the lilacs, a house that is no longer just Rosalind's, but ours. It is the heart of our new, strange, and wonderful family. We are having a simple, happy barbecue. Rosalind has planted a new, second lilac bush right beside the old, ancient one. One for each of them, she had told me, her own eyes shining, so they can finally grow together. I watch as my son Theo and my new niece Willow chase each other through the grass, their happy, joyful shrieks, a beautiful, healing music. And I think of my wife, my Sarah. The profound and deeply felt ache of her absence will never truly go away, but it is not a lonely ache anymore. It is a grief that is now shared, a memory that is now a living, breathing part of this new, beautiful family we have all built together from the wreckage of the past.
I had thought a year ago that my life was a ghost story, a quiet, sad tale of a love that had been lost forever. But I was wrong. The universe, in its own strange, mysterious, and deeply compassionate way, had not given me my wife back. It had given me the next best thing. It had given me the other half of her heart. An absolutely beautiful and moving story about a family secret and a connection that transcended a lifetime of separation. What do you think of the incredible coincidence that brought these two families together? Let us know in the comments below. If you were touched by this powerful and emotional story, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more incredible stories every day. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.